December 18th, 1946. The Copa Cabana nightclub, Manhattan. The most powerful crime bosses in America had gathered for what was supposed to be a peaceful summit meeting about territorial boundaries and profit sharing. 5 families from New York, representatives from Chicago, Detroit, and Philadelphia, all sitting at tables arranged in a careful circle designed to show mutual respect. The atmosphere was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Frank Costello sat directly across from Vito Genovese. Meyer Lansky occupied a corner table with his notebook, and Sam Giancana had flown in from Chicago specifically for this meeting. At the center of the room sat 2 men whose conflict would define organized crime for the next decade. Lucky Luciano, the acknowledged architect of modern organized crime, and Bumpy Johnson, the independent operator from Harlem, who refused to bow to anyone. Luciano had arrived wearing his most expensive suit, projecting authority and sophistication. Bumpy Johnson had entered at exactly 10:00 p.m., alone and wearing a simple but perfectly fitted black suit, a calculated decision that demonstrated supreme confidence. The meeting had been cordial for 2 hours. Handshakes, polite conversation, careful negotiations about who controlled what territories and how profits would be divided. But at 11:47 p.m., something happened that shocked every crime boss in the room and changed the balance of power in organized crime forever. The breaking point came when Bumpy Johnson delivered his rejection. Luciano had offered him consulting associate status with guaranteed income and territorial protection, all contingent on acknowledging the commission's authority. Bumpy listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, then stood up and delivered his response. "Charlie, I appreciate everything you've offered here tonight, but I already work for someone. I work for the people of Harlem. I can't accept any arrangement that puts someone else's authority above my responsibility to the people who depend on me." Lucky Luciano's face went through confusion, disbelief, then pure rage. Without warning, he stood up with such violence that his chair crashed backward, walked across the room, and spat directly in Bumpy's face. The room went silent. 30 of the most dangerous men in America watched as saliva dripped down Bumpy Johnson's cheek. The room went silent. 30 of the most dangerous men in America watched as saliva dripped down Bumpy Johnson's cheek. Everyone expected violence, gunfire, immediate retaliation that would turn the Copa Cabana into a battlefield. Instead, Bumpy Johnson reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a white silk handkerchief, and slowly wiped his face clean. "Thank you, Charlie," Bumpy said quietly, using Luciano's real name. "I needed that." What nobody understood that night, including Lucky Luciano himself, was that Bumpy Johnson had just declared war using a piece of cloth. What followed wasn't gunfire or assassination attempts. It was something far more devastating. The systematic destruction of everything Lucky Luciano had built, accomplished not through violence, but through a handkerchief that became the most dangerous weapon in organized crime history. But how does a simple gesture of cleaning one's face destroy a criminal empire? What did Bumpy Johnson do with that handkerchief that made Lucky Luciano lose everything he'd spent 20 years building? And why did wiping away spit become the beginning of the end for the man who created modern organized crime? The answer reveals something about power that most people never understand. Sometimes the most devastating response to disrespect isn't retaliation. It's making your enemy's insult the foundation of their own destruction. To understand how Bumpy Johnson used Lucky Luciano's spit to destroy his empire, you need to understand why Luciano thought he could humiliate the most dangerous man in Harlem and walk away unscathed. Charles Lucky Luciano was 49 years old in 1946, and he was arguably the most powerful criminal in American history. He had single-handedly reorganized Italian-American organized crime from warring gangs into a coordinated business enterprise. The Commission, the 5 families, the territorial agreements that prevented constant warfare, all of these innovations were Luciano's creations. But Luciano's path to power had been built on a simple principle: absolute respect for hierarchy. He'd survived the Castellammares War in the early 1930s by understanding that successful criminal organizations required clear chains of command, unquestioned authority, and swift punishment for anyone who challenged established order. Luciano had killed his way to the top, eliminating rivals like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano, who represented the old-school Sicilian approach to organized crime. He'd modernized the entire system, creating profit-sharing agreements, territorial boundaries, and dispute resolution mechanisms that had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to organized crime. But success had made Luciano rigid. After 15 years of having every decision accepted without question, every order followed without hesitation, every territorial claim respected without challenge, he'd lost the ability to handle legitimate disagreement or negotiated refusal. Bumpy Johnson represented everything that threatened Luciano's vision of organized crime hierarchy. Here was a black crime boss who controlled significant territory, generated substantial profits, and operated completely outside the Italian-American crime structure. Worse, Bumpy had connections to legitimate political figures and law enforcement officials that rivaled or exceeded Luciano's own influence. The December 18th meeting had been called specifically to resolve the Bumpy Johnson problem. For months, Luciano had been hearing reports from New York operations that an independent operator in Harlem was becoming too powerful, too visible, too successful to ignore. Federal law enforcement was starting to ask questions about why organized crime seemed to have different rules in Harlem than everywhere else. For 2 hours, the negotiation proceeded diplomatically. Luciano offered Bumpy recognition as an associate of the Genovese family, guaranteed protection from rival organizations, and the opportunity to expand his operations into other cities with commission approval. Bumpy listened politely, asked thoughtful questions, and then delivered his response with quiet dignity. "I appreciate the offer, Charlie, but I work for the people of Harlem. I don't work for the commission." That's when Luciano's control snapped. Being rejected wasn't just a business setback, it was a personal humiliation in front of every major crime boss in the country. If Bumpy Johnson could refuse Luciano's authority and walk away unharmed, what would prevent other independent operators from doing the same thing? Luciano's decision to spit in Bumpy's face was calculated to provoke exactly the kind of violent response that would justify immediate retaliation. He expected Bumpy to react with rage, to reach for a weapon, to do something that would allow Luciano to have him killed in self-defense, while 30 witnesses confirmed that Bumpy had been the aggressor. Instead, Bumpy Johnson calmly wiped his face and thanked Luciano for the insult. And in that moment, without anyone realizing what had just happened, the balance of power and organized crime shifted forever. December 19th, 1946, 8:30 a.m. Bumpy Johnson walked into the offices of the New York Daily News carrying a small package wrapped in brown paper. The package contained Lucky Luciano's spit. More specifically, it contained the white silk handkerchief that Bumpy had used to wipe Luciano's saliva from his face, now carefully preserved in a sealed evidence envelope along with sworn statements from 3 witnesses who had observed the incident at the Copa Cabana. But this wasn't just about preserving evidence. This was about understanding something fundamental about power that most people never grasp: the difference between reacting to disrespect and weaponizing it. Bumpy had spent the entire night after the Copa Cabana incident thinking about his options. He could have responded with traditional methods: violence, retaliation, a coordinated attack on Luciano's operations. Those approaches would have been expected, understandable, and ultimately counterproductive because they would have made Luciano a victim rather than revealing him as the perpetrator of his own downfall. Instead, Bumpy had recognized that Luciano's moment of rage had provided something far more valuable than any satisfaction that violence could deliver. It had provided proof of character. Lucky Luciano, in front of 30 witnesses, had demonstrated that when sophisticated negotiation failed to produce submission, he resorted to behavior that belonged in a schoolyard rather than a boardroom. "I'd like to speak with your crime reporter," Bumpy told the receptionist. "I have a story about respect, dignity, and what happens when powerful men forget that their authority comes from the people they serve, not the fear they inspire." The reporter who met with Bumpy Johnson was Walter Winchell, the most influential gossip columnist in America, whose daily broadcasts reached 30 million listeners and whose columns could make or break careers overnight. Winchell had been covering organized crime for 15 years, but he'd never encountered anything like what Bumpy Johnson was proposing: a deliberate media campaign designed to destroy Lucky Luciano through public humiliation rather than violence. "Mr. Johnson," Winchell said carefully, "you're asking me to publish a story about Lucky Luciano spitting in your face. Why would you want people to know about that? Doesn't that make you look weak?" Bumpy Johnson smiled and opened the evidence envelope, revealing the silk handkerchief stained with Lucky Luciano's saliva. "Mr. Winchell, this isn't about looking strong or weak. This is about showing people what Lucky Luciano really thinks of anyone who doesn't bow down to him. This is about demonstrating that the man who claims to represent honor and respect thinks it's appropriate to spit on other human beings when he doesn't get his way." Bumpy Johnson smiled and opened the evidence envelope, revealing the silk handkerchief stained with Lucky Luciano's saliva. Mr. Winchell, this isn't about looking strong or weak. This is about showing people what Lucky Luciano really thinks of anyone who doesn't bow down to him. This is about demonstrating that the man who claims to represent honor and respect in organized crime thinks it's appropriate to spit on other human beings when he doesn't get his way. Over the next hour, Bumpy Johnson told Walter Winchell a story that would change how America understood organized crime power dynamics. He explained that Lucky Luciano had called the Copa Cabana meeting specifically to force him into a subordinate position. He described how the negotiation had proceeded respectfully until Luciano realized that he couldn't control the outcome through intimidation or authority. The moment Charlie Luciano spat in my face, Bumpy said, he revealed something about himself that he spent 20 years trying to hide from the public and from other crime figures. He showed that underneath all the suits and the respect and the careful organization, he's just another bully who resorts to personal degradation when he can't get what he wants through legitimate means. Winchell understood immediately what Bumpy was offering. The chance to expose the gap between Lucky Luciano's public image as a sophisticated crime strategist and the reality of his behavior when that sophistication failed to produce desired results. What do you want me to write? Winchell asked.
I want you to tell the truth.
Bumpy replied. I want you to describe exactly what happened in that room. I want you to explain that Lucky Luciano, the man who claims to have brought honor and organization to organized crime, thinks it's acceptable to spit on people who disagree with him. December 20th, 1946. Walter Winchell's column in the New York Daily News carried a headline that sent shockwaves through organized crime circles across the country. Lucky's unlucky moment, when spit becomes the symbol of disrespect. The column was devastating in its simplicity. Winchell described the Copa Cabana meeting, the failed negotiation, and Lucky Luciano's decision to spit in Bumpy Johnson's face when diplomatic methods failed to produce submission. But the genius of the column wasn't in its factual reporting, it was in how Winchell framed the incident for his 30 million readers. He didn't focus on the criminal aspects of the meeting or the territorial disputes being negotiated. Instead, he focused on something far more damaging to Luciano's reputation. His character. Ladies and gentlemen, Winchell wrote, we're often told that organized crime figures operate according to codes of honor, respect, and dignity. We're told that these men, despite their illegal activities, maintain certain standards of behavior that distinguish them from common criminals. What happened at the Copa Cabana 2 nights ago suggests otherwise. When Lucky Luciano couldn't convince Harlem's Bumpy Johnson to accept subordinate status through negotiation, he resorted to the kind of behavior we'd expect from a frustrated child. He spat in the man's face. Mr. Johnson's response was illuminating. Instead of reacting with violence, he calmly wiped his face and thanked Mr. Luciano for revealing his true character. The silk handkerchief that cleaned away the saliva also wiped away any illusion that Lucky Luciano represents dignity or honor in organized crime. The column concluded with a question that would haunt Luciano for the rest of his career. If Lucky Luciano spits on people who disagree with him, what does that tell us about his fitness to lead anything more sophisticated than a playground argument? What made Winchell's coverage so devastating was its tone. He didn't write about Luciano as a dangerous criminal who should be feared. He wrote about him as a powerful man who had revealed himself to be fundamentally immature. Someone whose authority depended on intimidation rather than respect. December 21st, 1946. The story exploded across the country. Every major newspaper picked up Winchell's column. Radio stations read excerpts on their morning news programs. Magazine writers began investigating other instances of Lucky Luciano's behavior when he faced opposition or resistance. Within 48 hours, the image that Luciano had spent 20 years building, the sophisticated crime strategist who brought order and professionalism to organized crime, was replaced by a new narrative. The powerful man who spat on people when he didn't get his way. But the real damage wasn't to Luciano's public reputation. The real damage was to his standing within organized crime itself. December 22nd, 1946. Frank Costello received a phone call from Vito Genovese, who was calling from his exile in Italy. Frank, Genovese said without preamble, did you read Winchell's column about Charlie spitting on the Harlem guy? Yeah, I read it, Costello replied carefully. What do you think it means for our operations? Costello had been dreading this conversation, but he'd known it was inevitable. It means Charlie made us all look like amateurs. You can't run sophisticated criminal operations if people think your leadership consists of spitting on anyone who disagrees with you. That's what I was thinking too, Genovese said. Charlie's behavior at the Copa reflects on all of us. If he can't control his temper during a business negotiation, how can we trust him to represent our interests in other situations? Similar conversations were taking place in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and Boston. Crime bosses who had accepted Lucky Luciano's leadership for 20 years were suddenly questioning whether his decision-making process was reliable enough to govern their operations. The problem wasn't that Luciano had shown disrespect to Bumpy Johnson. Organized crime was built on displays of power and dominance. The problem was that he'd shown disrespect in a way that made him look childish, unprofessional, and incapable of maintaining composure during important negotiations. December 25th, 1946. Christmas Day. Lucky Luciano received a telegram from Frank Costello that changed everything. Commission meeting postponed indefinitely. Leadership questions require resolution before business operations can proceed normally. For the first time in 20 years, Lucky Luciano's authority within organized crime was being formally questioned by the people who had helped him build the commission system. The Handkerchief strategy was working exactly as Bumpy Johnson had planned. December 30th, 1946. Bumpy Johnson gave his second interview to Walter Winchell, this time focusing on what Luciano's behavior revealed about organized crime leadership in general.
Mr. Winchell, Bumpy said, people need to understand that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions. When Charlie Luciano spat in my face, he wasn't just disrespecting me. He was disrespecting every person who's ever tried to negotiate with him, every crime boss who's accepted his authority, and every community that's had to deal with his organizations.
The interview was published on January 2nd, 1947, and it contained a revelation that destroyed what remained of Luciano's credibility. Bumpy Johnson announced that he was donating Lucky Luciano's spit to the Smithsonian Institution as a historical example of what happens when power corrupts character. The silk handkerchief, preserved in its evidence envelope, would be displayed as part of an exhibit on American organized crime with a placard explaining how one moment of disrespect revealed the gap between organized crime's public claims of honor and the reality of its leadership behavior. The announcement created a media sensation that lasted for months. Newspaper editorials debated whether criminal evidence belonged in national museums. Radio commentators discussed the symbolism of preserving saliva as historical artifact. Magazine writers analyzed what the donation revealed about both Bumpy Johnson's character and American attitudes toward organized crime. But the real impact wasn't on public opinion. It was on organized crime itself. Crime bosses across the country realized that their private behavior could become public spectacle, that their moments of weakness could be preserved as permanent reminders of their failures, that their authority depended on maintaining respect that could be destroyed by a single careless action. Lucky Luciano's spit had become more than just evidence of disrespect. It had become a symbol of what happens when power operates without accountability, when authority believes it can behave without consequences, when leadership forgets that respect must be earned rather than demanded. January 15th, 1947. The commission met without Lucky Luciano for the first time since its creation. Frank Costello called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss whether Charlie Luciano's recent behavior represents the kind of leadership we want governing our operations. The discussion lasted 6 hours. Vito Genovese, calling from Italy, was direct. Charlie's behavior has made us all look like amateurs. We can't run sophisticated operations if people think our leadership consists of spitting on anyone who disagrees with us. Sam Giancana from Chicago agreed. My associates are questioning whether the commission is worth maintaining if this is how disputes get resolved. Meyer Lansky delivered the mathematical reality. Charlie's actions have cost us credibility in business relationships that took decades to build. The Smithsonian exhibition will be seen by millions who will associate organized crime with childish behavior. The final vote was unanimous. Lucky Luciano would retain his status as founder of the commission, but operational leadership would be transferred to Frank Costello. January 20th, 1947, Lucky Luciano received notice that his authority over American organized crime operations had been officially transferred to other leadership. The notification came with a gift, a silk handkerchief, identical to the one Bumpy Johnson had used to wipe away his spit. The accompanying note was signed by all 5 family leaders. Charlie, when you learn to control your temper, you can earn back your authority. Until then, use this to clean up any future mistakes. Lucky Luciano spent the rest of his life in Italian exile, never again exercising direct control over American organized crime. He died in 1962, remembered more for spitting on Bumpy Johnson than for creating the commission system. Bumpy Johnson's handkerchief strategy became legendary, studied by crime bosses who understood that the most effective way to destroy an enemy was through making their own behavior the weapon of their destruction. The silk handkerchief was displayed at the Smithsonian until 1975, with thousands read how one gesture of disrespect led to the downfall of organized crime's most powerful leader. December 18th, 1946. The night Lucky Luciano discovered that spitting on someone could destroy everything you've built if that someone understands how to turn your disrespect into your downfall. The night Bumpy Johnson proved that the most devastating response to insult isn't violence. It's making your enemy's behavior the foundation of their public humiliation. Lucky Luciano thought he was showing dominance by spitting in Bumpy Johnson's face. Instead, he provided the evidence that would end his career and redefine his legacy. A silk handkerchief, a moment of disrespect, a media campaign that lasted 6 months, the end of an empire built on authority that couldn't survive being exposed to its own character.
December 18th, 1946. The day Lucky Luciano spat away his empire, one drop of saliva at a time.